Hello, we're here at the Curious Minds podcast again, but a little bit of a different format today. We've got a couple guests in. We're going to be talking about science and faith, how to interpret scripture in regards to the age of the earth. So we'll get into all those topics. And I would say this was probably my route in with Christian apologetics, watching Kent Hovind decimate evolutionists. Now, I don't necessarily take his stance, but I was very fascinated with the ability for a Christian to defend his position in front of the academic elites in the areas of science. But I've looked into it a whole lot more since then and become surprised that there's actually multiple stances on this issue. There's God-fearing Christians like Hugh Ross, and there's God-fearing Christians like Ken Ham. They have very different interpretations of how to read the scripture as it relates to the age of the earth. For a while there was a trend, I think, in Christianity that set up a lot of divisiveness in this issue. It would have one side name-calling the other side. You don't take the Bible seriously, or the other side saying, well, you don't take science seriously. And there wasn't a whole lot of cordial dialogue. But I think the trend has been changing. I think both sides have an important contribution to make. In the past, it's been young Earth saying, remember, we need to take the Bible seriously. And that's a great contribution. And the other side saying, yeah, but we need to take science seriously. And that's a great contribution. Which brings me to maybe the introductory question and the balance we're trying to figure out. How in the world do we interpret science based on Scripture? If we go to complete science and leave out any scriptural interpretation, we'll run into error. If we do the opposite and we completely look at Scripture, try to bring out the meaning of the words without examining the world around us, we'll run into error also. So I think we're trying to figure out how to make that balance. And where things are uncertain, we're not sure how to interpret something in the Bible. How much do we allow science to guide our interpretation? Some say you can't do that at all. Others say you can do that some. How do we know exactly how much to do there, and vice versa? And is this even an important thing to do? Some people have their personal relationship with God, and that's great. But asking these tough questions about evidence for the Christian faith, they don't necessarily want to go there. They just want to have their personal faith, avoid looking too deep into it, avoid any controversial issue or an issue that we may disagree on, and keep their faith very personal and not really seek to connect that faith to the world around them. So that's some introductory stuff. And the first discussion point that you guys can chime in on, how do we weigh the value of the evidence of Scripture and the value of the evidence of science? And where one is uncertain, how much do we allow the other to inform our knowledge, our insight into the other? That's kind of the opening discussion. Let's meet the guests in here. Why don't you introduce yourself and make some comments about this issue?
Okay, well, thank you, Evan. My name's Mike Edenburn, and I'm a mechanical engineer by training. It was a long time ago that I had that training, but my field of interest was the thermal sciences, thermodynamics, heat transfer, and that sort of thing. And I worked as an engineer at Sandia National Laboratories for 35 years before retiring. Since then, I've kind of devoted myself to doing Bible studies with people, participating in Bible studies, working with international students, also coordinating a thing we call Science and Faith Seminars, which we do here. At the Christian Student Center.
Shameless plug.
Okay, relative to science and the Bible, I take both of them seriously. And I think that it's reasonable to say that God created this thing that we're studying in science, which is His creation. And if we do science objectively, without preconceived notions, and look at the data, then I would have to say that science, interpreted objectively, and the Bible, interpreted objectively, are going to work together and give us the same story. And if they don't seem to, I believe it's because we are misinterpreting one or the other or both.
All right, thank you. Doug?
Yes. I'm also a retired engineer from Sandia National Laboratories. I retired just a few years ago myself. Had a bachelor's degree in engineering science with minors in mathematics and physics, and then decided to switch to computer science. So went off and got my master's in computer science and really worked in that area, but I always loved physics. I love science. It's been an interest of mine to read a lot of material on creationism and evolution and study that for the last 2 or 3 decades. I agree with Mike that we have to believe science and the Scripture, but when someone claims there is a disagreement, I tend to come down on the side of Scripture more heavily than science. I think science, if it's correctly understood, is going to be consistent with Scripture. And I think where we get into problems is people who have an agenda to pursue a secular agenda may, in fact, be attempting to interpret science in a way that would be contrary to Scripture. And so I tend to take the Bible as literally as I can, reasonably can, knowing that there are some things in the Bible that are figurative, like the book of Revelation is the best example of that. But I take most of the Bible rather literally. Now, if there is proven science that disagrees with what Scripture seems to say, I would go back and see if it would make sense to reinterpret Scripture to make the two consistent. But generally speaking, I tend to come down on the side of the literal interpretation, which is why I'm a young earth creationist.
All right. Move into some Bible hermeneutics there and expound on some of those ideas. I've heard that the genre of Genesis 1 is really hard to pin down. So when we look at it in terms of pure historical account, it's hard to find a matching account that looks like it, that can also show that it's historical. At the same time, it doesn't look entirely poetic either. So why don't you guys comment on what is Genesis 1? What genre is it? What's it meant to explain?
Okay, well, let's see. I believe that Genesis 1, first of all, I want to say that I believe it's true. But I also believe that it's poetic. Now, I know my Hebrew scholar friends say, well, it's not Hebrew poetry, but then they also admit that it may not have been originally recorded in Hebrew. I say, well, what language would it have been recorded in? Well, perhaps Adamic, the language of Adam, whatever that was. But there are some structural elements to it, like every day starts off with, and God said. Every one of them kind of ends with, and it was evening and it was morning. Day one, or a second day, a third day, so forth. And then they all finish up with, and God saw that it was good or very good. So it has a structure to it, which I take to be poetic in some sense. If it's poetic, then I think that some interpretations that are not absolutely literal are in keeping. And one interesting thing I've seen about some interpretations of it is that the first 3 days were where God created those things that provided for what he created on days 4, 5, and 6. Like, for example, on day 1, God said, let there be light. And that provided for the sun, moon, and the stars on day 4. And on the second day, he separated the waters from the heavens, or the water from the sky. And that was to provide for the sea creatures and the birds on day 5. And then on day 3, the dry land appeared and vegetation, which provided for the land animals and man on day 6. So while I think that it is telling a true story, it's doing it in a poetic way.
And that kind of hints at the genre and the timeline, Doug. So do you take the formulation of that chapter to be a timeline, or are you open to what Mike is saying?
I take it to be history primarily, not just allegorical or poetic. I think it's interesting you mentioned about the stars being created on the 4th day, because I think we would then agree that the Big Bang, the way it's being presented as the supposed origin of the universe, stars would have come about at the very beginning or early in the cycle. I know there's energy and stuff, but the idea that we would have plants appear before stars were created would have been somewhat unthinkable, I think, according to the Big Bang theory. And so I tend to accept it as history. And I've known old Earth creationist friends who say, well, what it really says is God created. And I think we both agree on that.
Absolutely.
That God created this. However, it was not something that came about through some just natural phenomena, unguided processes. You mentioned in notes you gave us about the Hebrew word yom for day. And I've read some explanations of that. There's a really good, thorough explanation in the Genesis account by Dr. Jonathan Safardi, creationist. I found out when I went and listened to him here in town a year or two ago. He's a Jew by birth and a Christian by belief. So he knows Hebrew and has a background in that. What they say is that the word yom is generally, almost always, interpreted as a 24-hour day. That it can be interpreted in a few cases as a term that may not refer to a specific 24-hour day, the day of the Lord. But the words that are used in the context it's used in, where it mentions evening and morning, and where it says day 1 or the second day or the third day, in that context, it generally means a real 24-hour day. So that's another reason I accept it that way. By the way, I was originally an old Earth creationist. because I accepted the fact, well, scientists say the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, whatever the number is, or the universe is 13.7 billion years old, therefore they must know what they're talking about. Therefore, I have to fit the Bible into what science has proven. Well, now we've found out more about science and discovered that it is not necessary for me to believe that the Earth is that old, and so I've become a young Earth creationist.
And let me bring up something else. Genesis 2:4. It talks about on the day, Yom, singular, that the earth was created, referring back to the previous 6 days. So in that case, very close to Genesis 1, the word Yom is used to cover a several day period.
Okay, so here's Genesis 2, 1 through 3. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed and all their hosts. By the seventh day God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. And then verse 4 should start chapter 2, and it says, "This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord made earth and heaven."
Now, he did create it on one day. This is in the beginning, he created the heavens and the earth. And then he can begin modifying what he created. So you can probably say, if you point back to the day when he created it, well, the first day was the day he created the earth in its entirety.
So Doug is saying, unless we have clear evidence that Yom should mean something different, our default position should be that it's a 24-hour day. You think that's an accurate hermeneutic, or do you think there's enough that we should change the definition of Yom in the first chapter?
Well, I think that all things should be considered, certainly the way it's used in the Bible, but also scientific evidence. And if the scientific evidence leads us to put a little different interpretation on the Bible that is consistent with the rest of the Bible, I believe that's a reasonable thing to do.
So I'm a philosophy major, or was, so I love this topic, philosophy of science. And I think Doug especially has hinted at it. So Frank Turek, he's an apologist. He says science doesn't say anything, scientists do. And so that opens a little bit of a philosophy of science can of worms. It opens up the door for biases to come in. Because science doesn't speak, scientists do, they are going to allow their biases to come in, and evidence is going to be what they want evidence to look like. Why don't you guys comment on that? How strictly are biases influencing what we view as science, and especially in the academy at UNM or something like that?
Oh, yes. Well, it is true that the scientists interpret observations, and there are many places where they have interpreted them incorrectly, like, for example, in evolution, which I think we would agree that science is interpreting that wrong. But I believe that there are also a lot of observations that speak clearly for themselves, and that it's not just a matter of the scientists misinterpreting them, which they do sometimes, but there's a lot of observation that is very clear, regardless of how it might be interpreted.
Do you have an example of that, maybe?
Well, for example, the observation that we have a sun that is producing energy, and it comes up day after day. So, yeah, there are a lot of observations that do not lend themselves to different interpretations, but they speak for themselves.
Yeah. Well, there's an example I can give you. I was listening to a DVD where a documentary on the Exodus, and the gentleman conducting that went and interviewed all kinds of archaeologists and researchers in that area. And there were very different views of when the Exodus occurred. And someone asked this one, I guess he was a Christian, says, "Don't you have biases about this? Because you'd believe that there was an Exodus and it occurred at a certain time." And he says, "Yeah, everybody in this field has biases, but you can't make up the data."
Good point.
And that was the point that I really resonated with. Science provides us with data, and generally speaking, if it's well taken, we can't argue with the data. And where most of the arguments develop is in the interpretation of the data. And biases get to be a very strong element in that. One example is a woman who's been unearthing dinosaur remains in northern Montana. And she's unearthed a number of dinosaur fossils where there was soft tissue or DNA. Well, prior to that, the consensus was that DNA couldn't last millions of years, and the soft tissue couldn't last millions of years. So when they found it, the question immediately that she asked was, wow, how did this last millions of years? Instead of backing up and saying, well, maybe it wasn't millions of years old. So the bias kind of drives your thinking on some of those things, and they have made such a firm assumption that the Earth is millions of years old that when the data says something different, they don't believe it.
Yeah, and that kind of leads us to think that the background information, the background biases, the background studies that scientists have engaged in has kind of guarded what the evidence is supposed to look like. Like with dating methods, they'll have an assumption that it's supposed to lie in this range, and these outliers are going to show that the date is in these other areas. They may have 6 pieces of evidence of how old they should consider it. They're going to have the assumption also of what they expect the age of it to be. And in my estimation, they continue building on these previous ideas. It takes this long for this much sand to develop, so the fossils that are this deep will be this old, and since these animals are deeper than these animals came from these animals, and in 1859, when Origin of Species came out, it built a new foundation of how we're going to interpret every fossil, every living thing, every rock layer from that point forward. And so I walk over here to UNM, or consider the other colleges in the country, and think they are churning out these ideas left and right, and they have poured millions or billions of dollars into this. Aren't we kind of behind the 8 ball with saying we can present a Christian position that's different, and they have poured so much into it, it seems so unlikely that they would want to turn from that.
Yeah. The woman that was in Montana, unearthing the dinosaur skeletons, was trying to get her data published, and she was unable to get it published. She finally, apparently, as the story is, went to some publisher and says, how much evidence do I have to present before you'll allow me to publish a paper showing the soft tissue, and etc.? And the answer was none. You can't give us enough evidence to make us let you publish this data. So there is a bias there against publishing things that are at odds with the currently accepted ideas.
So let me see if I can get it in perspective a little bit. There are some areas where bias plays a big role and leads us astray. But for the vast majority of science, it's unbiased. It's objective. Things like medical science, material properties, electricity, computers, cell phones. I mean, you trust your cell phone, don't you? So while there are some areas where there is bias, the vast majority of science, I think, has been used properly and interpreted properly.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think you're right. I think the areas where the bias creeps in is where there is basically a kind of religion, if you would
absolutely
call it that. A secular
yes.
humanist religion that says that the earth couldn't have been created by God, therefore it had to have come about very slowly over time. And so that's where we get into the disagreements, not on the basic science and the basic data. We agree. That's good information.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, while I believe in an old Earth, I also believe that Darwinian evolution is definitely an error.
Interesting. So continuing off the point of the biases, sometimes you hear that these Christian organizations aren't legitimate scientific organizations, like the Discovery Institute up in Seattle, for instance. It looks like they're doing legitimate science. They have their bias too. They have the type of evidence that they want to present to the world. But the accusation is this isn't accepted by science, or the term that I keep hearing, maybe you guys can shed some light on it. They haven't released peer-reviewed literature, so we shouldn't take it seriously.
And that may have been true at one time, but not anymore. You mentioned the Discovery Institute. They have this publication they call Biocomplexity, which is refereed, and they do have peer review of the articles. Okay. And I believe the... The American Scientific Affiliation publishes articles that are reviewed by other scientists. Mm-hmm. So a blanket condemnation that says that the Christian organizations don't peer review their articles is no longer true.
And that's something that's trending upward, we might say.
Yes, I think so. Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize that, but that's a good improvement. Glad to hear that.
Got anything on that, Doug?
Yeah, what I have noticed in at least the creationist material I've read is they tend to cite heavily from the secular scientific sources. They aren't making up their own data. They aren't going out and performing their own separate research that is at odds with data that's being produced in the rest of the scientific world. They're just taking the data that's being produced by the mainstream science and reinterpreting. A lot of this becomes a matter of the narrative. If you've got a narrative you want to present, if it's an evolution narrative, you're going to try to squeeze all the data in to support the evolutionist narrative. But if you're creationist, you're probably going to take this very same data and come up with a very reasonable interpretation that doesn't include evolution. So it's really a more matter of interpretation than anything else. Science and the data is all shared in common.
So related to peer review, it seems like in America and probably worldwide, they'll show that the more prestige that a college gets, the more secular it tends to become. Or you can look at the National Academy of Science, organizations like that is probably the top tier in American science, and they'll show you how few believers there are, or how few young earthers there are, how few creationists there are. And they'll say, look, as you increase in intelligence, as you increase in knowledge in these sciences, you tend to become less convinced of God. God becomes less in the picture as science increases, you might say. And this sets up peer pressure. You want to look prestigious to your colleagues, you have to use less God in your material and more of what they expect to see, more that contributes to the route that they've already gone.
If I was advising a person trying to move up in the scientific ranks, I would advise them not to let it be known that they're a creationist until they get tenure and maybe get a Nobel Prize. Because if you notice, what happened to Michael Behe? Nobel Prize winner, wrote a great book that basically was a refutation of Darwinianism. You never heard much more about him. I think he got blackballed by the scientific community as soon as he came out. Fortunately, he had tenure. He had a Nobel Prize, so he could survive on the basis of that.
What's interesting is a lot of people would say that modern science got started by Christians. And there's a whole list of them like Newton and I think Schrödinger, Boyle, where science got started back in the 17th century. They were Christians. Newton was doing it for God's glory. But today, it is true. There was a movie out several years ago called Expelled. And I think that did a pretty good job of showing some of the bias, because researchers who have come out challenging Darwinism have lost their jobs. They can't get published in mainstream journals. So yeah, there is a great deal of bias against people coming out with challenges to Darwinism in particular, and biblical things probably more generally.
And there's two ways to interpret that. I've heard it on a different radio show. If a person rejects evolution, they're likely to lose their job in that respective field. Okay, do they lose their job because science is so convinced that this is true that you can't possibly be a good scientist without it? Or is this just they'll lose their job? That's showing the bias against an alternative explanation.
And how do you distinguish between the two? If scientists are so convinced that they're right, they may think very legitimately in their own minds, well, this guy couldn't be a good scientist because he's publishing something that's creationist, when in reality, maybe he's on the right track.
Yeah, Darwinists tend to believe that it is absolutely true. As a matter of fact, I went to a meeting in Santa Fe where they were talking about the science curriculum, and the audience, 99%, wanted evolution taught as a fact in our public schools, and basically that's what's happening today. But there are a few people that don't go along with that. So there is a great deal of bias. And I completely agree with your advice that you should not admit your beliefs against Darwin or for Christianity until you get that PhD and then can contribute to science.
So thinking well deals with presenting a set of ideas that you can think critically through. As you mentioned, 99% say teach Darwinism in schools. I think, great, teach it in schools. Teach alternative ideas. Don't tell them what to think, teach them how to think. And I wonder how this might look a little different if we alter the education to look more at presenting multiple sides and saying, where do you think the evidence lies? Think well through this. And I think it would be more important to teach kids to think well about it than to tell them what to think, even if what you're telling them what to think happens to be true.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, what you're saying is absolutely true. Look at the advantages. It's going to make science more interesting. The students are going to learn critical thinking. Hopefully they'll carry that into their jobs and they'll be the ones that discover new things rather than sticking with pat answers. So yeah, big advantages. And science itself is not something that censors opinions that are contrary to it. Science is something that wants to look at the different ideas and weigh them. And if science is censoring one idea, then it's not good science.
I wrote a letter to the state school board when they had the controversy in the meeting up there in Santa Fe. Let students be taught both views. Let people be taught about evolution, but let them be allowed to challenge evolution. And let's let the best ideas win out. And I think that's exactly what we should do in our public schools.
Absolutely.
So this is an unpredictable route kind of to conclude on in this discussion portion, but I think it's for the better. I find it really interesting, and I think we've left with something very constructive to kind of leave listeners with. We've talked about the importance of this issue of uniting science and faith. Talked about some Bible hermeneutics, how to interpret Genesis 1, which is still up for debate. We'll talk more about that soon. feel like we've got the most meat out of the philosophy of science, just critically looking at the scientific establishment and saying, how can we maximize on it? How could it be used to the best? How can the biases be removed? And just critically thinking. We've got Doug Brown to my right, Mike Edenburn to my left, guests in here. That's going to wrap up this first portion, this discussion portion. We'll be back with the debate portion on the age of the Earth, so looking forward to that. Until then, God bless and guide you.